So welcome to this SSCR webinar, which is on the topic of conversation analysis this week. My name's Yvonne Burks, I'm the Deputy Director of the school, and I'm here to chair this session. It's not an approach we've seen lots and lots of in NIHR, so it's exciting to have a seminar on this. And it'll be great to hear more about it. So we have a double-hander today. We've got Joe, who is a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at Bristol, and he's also one of SSCR's Capacity Building Research Fellows. So that's great to be hearing from him. Joe has published in a variety of areas, but he's also done a lot of work in the field of dementia, if I'm correct, Joe.
That's correct.
Great. And we also have John from Bristol, who's a senior lecturer in social work, and he's used conversation analysis for understanding and improving professional encounters. So lots of expertise in the room from both John and Joe. So if you can put questions in the chat, I will monitor the chat and we'll see how much time we've got left at the end. If possible, people can ask their own questions, but if not, I'll try and formulate some questions if time is short. But I'm going to hand over now to John and Joe, and they can give us the webinar.
Great, thanks, Yvonne. And let me see, have the slides come up there okay? Can everyone see that first one? Yep.
You appear to have changed screens from when we practiced 2 minutes ago, because now we've got your notes pages.
let me switch that around. Not sure how that. Hold on. How's that?
Perfect.
Better. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll try and give you a little bit of background to conversation analysis as an approach. Pick out some kind of key principles, I suppose, of how people might use it, the kind of questions that it might ask, and go through some of the kind of practical steps around collecting data and analysing it with a few examples. And then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for questions at the end as well. So we thought we might start off really with a kind of broad statement about what conversation analysis is. It's, as the name suggests, the analysis of conversation. But it's a particular approach to research that is based on recordings of natural interaction. And the aim is to describe the kind of patterns that are there and underlying the interaction, and also the organisation of it and the way that people organise both verbal and non-verbal interaction to achieve certain things through their talk. Just a couple of kind of historical threads, if you like, around the kind of where conversation analysis came out from. There's a long-standing concern about the question of social order and how do societies and how do people manage to kind of work together, to collaborate together, to exist together in society. It goes back to Thomas Hobbes, but also in the 20th century, the work of Talcott Parsons was kind of influential in terms of a functionalist sociology. There were some trends against that in the 1960s that conversation analysts drew from, which we've listed here. So Howard Garfinkel and his work in ethnomethodology argued that rather than just following rules about society that were kind of handed down to people, that people both kind of produced and reproduced the rules in their own behaviours. So he made this argument that people are not cultural dopes, that they're kind of active in that process of establishing order in their relationships. Erving Goffman was working around the same time and very interested in ideas about kind of how people use gestures and facial expressions. Later on, he described this as the interaction order. He wasn't specifically focused on conversation, but he was very interested in communication in those ways. And then the third thread that we've identified here is speech act theorists. So John Austin is one example, and they were interested in how language could be used not just to describe things, but to make things happen in the world. So the classic example there of the marriage ceremony, where the person presiding over the ceremony says, "I now pronounce you man and wife," and that means that the marriage came into existence. So conversation analysts generally kind of refer back to this man, Harvey Sachs, who was working with Garfinkel and Goffman and drew together these ideas to focus really on interaction, on conversation as a specific kind of form of interaction, and looking at the underlying principles and rules that people followed themselves, rather than following kind of external rules about society. Now, he was looking initially at recordings of telephone calls that came into a psychiatric helpline. So people that were concerned about suicide would phone this helpline. And he became very interested in some of the patterns that there were in the talk. So, for example, pretty much all of the calls started with this pair of greetings where the worker would say hello and the caller would say hello. Almost all of the calls then went on with the worker giving their name. So, for example, "This is Mr. Smith, may I help you?" And what he noticed was that predominantly people used that to then give their own name. "Yes, this is Mr. Brown." But there were a few examples where he saw something different happening. So having established that people were kind of taking it in turns to talk and using those turns to do things like give their name and then kind of reciprocate that, there were these other examples where something different happened. So when the worker was saying, "This is Mr. Smith, may I help you?" the caller, instead of giving their own name, might say something like, "I can't hear you." So expressing maybe a difficulty in hearing or understanding. And then when Mr. Smith confirmed that, the caller would just repeat that in a confirmation of hearing. So, "This is Mr. Smith, Smith." And what Harvey Sachs noticed from that is that the opportunity that people might use that intentionally or unintentionally as a way of not giving their own name, which of course might be relevant if you're in a vulnerable situation calling a suicide helpline. You might not want to give your name, and this might be one way of kind of making that possible in a polite way without causing offence. So Sachs introduced this notion that interaction is sequenced, that this is a really important way in which people manage their interactions and analyze what's going on. It was in contrast from kind of other linguistic work that was going on at the time. So Chomsky famously argued that spoken language and spoken communication was too corrupt to be analysed in its own form, and that it was actually a version of an underlying set of rules which formed the basis of communication. Sachs turned that on its head, and he said that actually the way that people use conversation is, he used this phrase, exquisitely ordered, and that by using this concept of sequence and analysing conversation turn by turn, it became possible to subject it to empirical analysis. So whereas Chomsky said that conversation was too messy, Sachs said that there was order at all points, and that when people are talking to each other, then they're able to manage all the messiness because they're analysing what's happening at that moment. So they know what's going on. It's not too messy. Conversation analysts focus not so much on what people say, but on what action the talk performs. So they're interested in how people use talk to achieve things like introducing themselves or avoiding giving their names. And in that sense, there's a view of language then, not as a window to what's going on inside a person's mind, but with an interest in what people do with language and also with how they do it. So the kinds of questions that the conversation analysts like to ask and that we like to think that we can answer can be divided into two kind of broad categories. So one category of conversation analysis might be described as basic. I'm going to start using the term CA. And this is concerned with the kind of universal underlying patterns in language. Trying to describe the basic machinery in terms of things like taking turns or when people interrupt each other or talk, there's kind of overlapping talk. And you might see these features in everyday situations. The other branch of CA takes a more applied approach and looks at specific settings. So there's been a lot of work done in different professional settings, and thinking specifically about health and social care settings, there are these kind of three types of questions that CA might be applied to. So you might have descriptive questions, such as how health and social care tasks or goals might be accomplished. So for example, how a personal assistant supports an adult with a learning disability to make choices in a supermarket, choosing what kind of things to buy. There might be relational questions where conversation analysts will explore the relationships between interactional practices and outcomes. So if you have a questionnaire which is designed to measure or assess a level of dementia, the way that those questions in that questionnaire get asked have been shown to have different implications for the outcomes of that questionnaire and the result of that assessment. And then thirdly, there are causal questions which will evaluate talk-based interventions. Many health and social care interventions are interaction-based. We know, for example, colleagues at Oxford using CA to look at weight loss programs as a way to support people in losing weight. I'm going to hand you over to Joe now.
Thank you, John. Just leave this so I can click through. So one of the big questions that people often ask is, why not just ask people about their communication directly? Why not just ask them what they're doing? And there are good reasons for this. So things like focus groups and interviews do remain the method of choice for a lot of qualitative researchers, but there are well-recognized problems posed by kind of researcher-generated data. So the first of these could be something like, are our research participants telling us what really happened? Now, that may not be an issue depending on the kind of research question you want to answer. If you're interested in people's perceptions or their experiences, then that can serve you well. But if you want to look at what actually happened and how interaction kind of unfold turn by turn, then that might not do well for you. The other issue is that often people might not be able to remember exactly what happened in communication. So if you are looking at, I suppose, let's give an example of how people with dementia are asked about their memories and how people are kind of ushered into conversations about their past. You could ask, for example, staff members how they did that or how they do it routinely, but the details of how they do that, they might not actually remember or might not be able to recall in the moment. So it's really important to actually look at what really happens. Also, people's answers might be influenced by social desirability effect. So if you were interested in, for example, understanding a bit more about people's drinking habits and patterns, they might not give an answer which is directly correlated to what really happens, you know, in terms of the amount they drink. And also, of course, in telling people about an event, you inevitably put a slant on it. And conversational analysis seeks to kind of be removed from the potential of having a slant on it by actually just focusing on the data as it happens. So things like focus groups and interviews could be seen as removed from the phenomenon itself, if it's the phenomenon indeed that you're interested in. So in things like interviews and focus group research, researchers face the difficulty of how to theorize the relationship between participants' talk and the thing they're talking about. So you could look at it like there's a gap between the data, the talk about the experience, and what the researchers are most interested in, which can be the experience itself. So what differentiates data in conversation analysis? Well, there are two tests, I suppose, to kind of identify whether it is indeed naturalistic data. So the first is that it's not data collected from or generated by the researcher themselves, or instigated by the researcher. So it's not introspection, it's not field notes, it's not interviews or experiments where the researcher is kind of testing out something in the world. So the two tests that I suppose you could look at to confirm if it's naturalistic data are the unwell social scientist test and recovery of action. So the unwell social scientist test refers to a kind of principle that would the thing that you're interested in, that you want to collect data on, would it be happening anyway if it just so happened that you were unwell on the day of data collection? So the principle of conversation analysis in terms of data collection is you're trying to record and collect data on things that really happen, whether or not you are present. Recovery of action refers to if in the analytic process, how much you could, to what extent you could get back to the phenomenon itself as it happened. So for example, if you were working from thematic analysis and looking at all of the codes you had generated, would you be able to get back from those codes some semblance of what really happened? And arguably, the answer is not. Whereas with conversation analysis, the transcription is done to such a level of detail, constantly referring back to the data itself in an iterative process, that you're trying to produce as close to possible analysis of what really happened by kind of reifying that in the transcript. The way that you go about collecting data is through recording. So if you're interested in telephone calls, you might hook up a recorder to the telephone or use some kind of audio recorder. If you're interested in action which is happening, which might be kind of if it's important for you to also take into account things like body language, eye gaze, things like that, then obviously you're going to want to use recording devices. So if the action that you want to capture is static, you could use a static camera fixed to the wall, which is on the far left. If, for example, the action or the thing that you want to capture is you're not able to kind of know in advance exactly how it's going to play out, maybe there's going to be a lot of movement, maybe you're going to have to adjust the camera on the fly, you might want to wear something like a badge cam, which is essentially like a lanyard but kind of attached to your chest. People used to use kind of the bigger cameras. Obviously, now with the way technology is evolving constantly, cameras are much more discreet and much more easily maneuverable, as you can see on the far right, which is an example of a GoPro camera, which lots of people like using now. So some of the benefits of using naturalistic data: it doesn't flood the research setting with the questioner's own categories and assumptions that might, for example, be embedded in questions or probes. So it's seeking to capture what really happens, not what you're interested in. It doesn't put people in the position of having to account for what they do or be, as Potter calls it, disinterested experts, by encouraging them to provide normatively appropriate descriptions for their for what they've done. And I think this has been really important for my research, is that it doesn't require participants to do anything other than what they would normally be doing. So this can be, for example, a particular benefit to populations who might be excluded from other kinds of research because of communication impairments. Equally, when I've done research in learning disability and dementia settings, it can be of great use to be able to explain to either gatekeepers or the staff themselves that that it's not going to take up any of their time, in the sense that you don't want them to do anything other than they would normally be doing. So you will be there and present, but it's not going to take up time in the same way that multiple interviews might. But of course, there are introducing a camera into any setting means that there might be issues with data collection. So the first of these that people often bring up is that the bind of, do individuals modify their behavior in response to the awareness of being observed? And this is called the Hawthorne effect. And this is a very big topic. There's been an awful lot written about this, and it's too much for me to cover in one slide. So I will say yes and no, and then expand on it slightly. So we know from previous research that people do report having some kind of effect from the camera. But we also know that it's very difficult to moderate certain aspects of people's behavior or communication that's kind of hardwired into how we interact, built up over obviously many years. There are certain things that happen too fast for the brain to compute. So things like speech patterns and eye gaze and pauses and things that kind of almost underlie interaction. It's often hard for people to adapt or change those in response to things that are happening, in situ. Also, there are ways to, it would be disingenuous to say that to claim that having a camera present doesn't in any way change what's happening. But of course, the paradox is you can't ever know for sure how much it changed, because you don't see what is unobserved. But there are ways to mitigate against those kinds of issues. Something that I found really useful, for example, is taking a pre-data collection period and making yourself kind of known in the setting, becoming well acquainted with the potential participants, with staff members if you're working in social care, and I suppose becoming a part of the furniture, so that before you press record, you might have had a few weeks or even months whereby you've given people a chance to get used to you, so that your presence is not going to be so distracting, or indeed distracting at all by the time you start data collection. Equally, what other people have done, such as Marcus Jepson in his intellectual disability research, is give participants the camera to play with over numerous sessions before you start recording, so that it doesn't become this scary object. You're not suddenly introducing some foreign kind of slightly oppressive object into the setting, but actually it becomes something which is normalized. Equally, what some other researchers have done, if you're able to record something which over repeated instances, for example, GP consultations, which there's been a lot of conversation analysis research on, sometimes people advise not keeping, if you're collecting kind of 40 or 50 of those with one GP, perhaps not keeping the first few, so that your data collection starts, I suppose, or the analysis starts when the GP has become more used to the camera being around. And I would say that in general, people do become, in my experience, people become quite acclimatized to the recording device very quickly. Of course, there are ethical issues with introducing recording, especially when if you're using a video camera, increases the chances of people being identifiable. So I think there are some basic issues that people need to take into account. The first is the acceptability of making recordings in some settings. Now, I'm speaking to a social care audience. Of course, there are many instances in social care where the setting might be include vulnerable people, or the potential for people to be upset or distraught. So you need to think really carefully about how acceptable or feasible it is to introduce a camera into that setting. One way that you might think about doing this is to work with stakeholder groups, gatekeepers, PPI groups, to talk about how feasible and acceptable it might be, and what might be the issues, what ways you might ameliorate those or work around them. And one thing I would say, if you're thinking about using conversation analysis in a potentially difficult setting in that sense, is that it has been used in almost every setting you could possibly imagine, including some settings which are very, very sensitive. So there are ways to work around it, but it involves making sure you listen and work with the people that you in a pre-data collection phase that you're seeking to collect data on. You might want to talk to people, potential participants, about how you're going to use the data, and give people the option to agree or not to the use of the data in certain kinds of ways. So, for example, people might be happy for you to use the data in anonymized transcripts for presentations and in publications, but they might not want to tick the box which says that you will use their anonymized video data in presentations, for example. Of course, with there are always issues with transfer and storage of data, but particularly when that data is so readily identifiable, if it's by a video camera, for example. So with transfer and storage, you need to make sure you're putting things on encrypted hard drives with password protected. You might also think about adding a filter that you can take on or off, so that if for any reason the data was seen by someone else in a situation which you couldn't control, there might be a filter which kind of anonymized it anyway. That brings us on to the last point about anonymizing video and audio data. It's routine in conversation analysis to do things like data sessions, where you work with researchers from other fields, other institutions, to look at data that you've collected. The way that it's typically done in terms of anonymizing practices is that often the pitch of the audio is changed so that it stops people's voices being so readily identifiable. Often there's a filter that's put over the video, but so that it's perhaps slightly blurred. And I think depending on the data, you have to make a kind of an informed choice about the extent you want to blur the video and what's appropriate, because of course lots of what you might be interested in are things like eye gaze, gesture, posture, and if you blur the video to such an extent that those things are not possible to analyze or indeed to show other people, then that can become an issue. So I suppose the extent to which you anonymize the video relates to what you've agreed with your participants, of course, but also the kinds of phenomena that you might be interested in. Now, I've already mentioned briefly that conversation analysis is kind of built on transcription as a key part of the method and methodology. Conversation analysis uses transcription as an approach which was developed by Gail Jefferson. And you can see a kind of the most up-to-date, I suppose, iteration of how that's done in Bolden and Hepburn's book, Transcribing for Social Research. And this is a key step in the analysis process. It's not something that could kind of be skipped over. The analysis follows really strict conventions to preserve as much detail as possible. So I won't say everything, that the transcription does, but it's things like in-breaths and out-breaths, pauses in milliseconds and silences, size, tone of voice, whether the prosody, whether people start speaking fast or slow relative to the speech around them, when people overlap or interrupt each other, So talk is really detailed when you start to look at it very closely. But I suppose the main important point is that all of those things matter. And we can see that from the way that talk kind of runs off. So these transcripts are an evolving document. You're always going back to your original video or audio recordings in order to update them. You might hear something on the 50th time of listening, which you didn't hear in the previous 49 listens, that changes the meaning or changes the transcript and perhaps changes the meaning of the analysis. And of course, data must be anonymized in the transcript. So routinely, you're going to take out names and identifiable information. What people often do is replace them with pseudonyms with the same kind of syllable pattern and stress, so that if it's important for the analysis, the syllable length is the same. You replace them with like for like. And the reason that we go into that level of detail is because we know from all the previous research that's been done is that no order of detail in interaction can be dismissed a priori as disorderly, accidental, or irrelevant. Essentially, people have reasons for doing the things that they do. They have reasons for saying the things that they say. And as John mentioned earlier, you can look at that as ways to produce actions and get things done in the social world. So the way, whether people pause at a certain point, whether they go up or down at the end of the sentence, that's not random. They're trying to do something by inflecting their speech in a certain way to do an action. And these are some of the transcription symbols that Gail Jefferson developed, and this is just a few. But we don't have time to go through every single one right now, but I thought it might be useful to have a look at a couple to see why they matter. So the numbers that you'll see throughout conversation analysis transcripts relate to measures of pauses or silences in seconds and milliseconds. And you might think, well, that seems like a crazy amount of detail to go into, but it really does matter. So here's an example why. So on line 1, we see a telephone ring. On line 2, Gordon answers it and says, hello. Now, we know from what John showed us earlier that from the earliest origins of conversation analysis that you can analyze talking sequences, and greeting sequences tend to run off in very normative ways. And we all know those because we do them in everyday life. You say, hello, how are you? Not too bad, how are you? Fine. And then you move on to, once you've done this kind of almost procedural kind of getting through with that opening sequence, then you move on to the reason for the telephone call. So what we might be expecting here is another hello to follow immediately afterwards. But what we get is a silence of 0.7 seconds. So in less than a second or around a second into the call, we already know something's not quite right. And what happens is Dana, who is Gordon's girlfriend, says, hello, where have you been all morning? So she's dispensed with the greetings and gone straight into what it turns out is a complaint sequence, because she's been ringing and ringing and ringing Gordon and he hasn't picked up. So if everything had been fine and this had been a normal sequence, you wouldn't have got this pause at line 3. So even just those few lines can tell us a lot about what's going on for the participants and indeed where the interaction is going to go. So we've had a look at pauses. We also do things like we look at where talk overlaps. And people are generally pretty good at not talking too much at the same time as each other. In fact, generally we design the way we talk to start immediately after someone else is finished. But there is often times where we overlap as well. And it's interesting to look at where those occur and why. So why do people talk at the same time when generally that's not a good way to do interaction? Well, one way I thought I might demonstrate this is by looking at what happens in the first few seconds of a personal independence payment assessment. So this is something that I'm working on at the moment. and I was really interested by this initial sequence. So generally, we try to avoid talking at the same time as each other unless we are kind of aggressively trying to cut in and cut someone off to make our own point, but that isn't what happens here. So the healthcare professional, we've got the healthcare professional and the claimant. The healthcare professional says, okay, then we'll start the assessment. So my name's Linda Blackwell. And at that point, the claimant says, hi. And that TCH that you can see there is the way that you transcribe a kind of click of the tongue, which is already in overlap. And she then goes on to say, I'm a clinical nurse specialist, but and you can see on line 5, what the claimant is doing is trying to introduce himself, saying, I'm Jonathan. And we can see that that's delivered in overlap. So he's saying that at the same time as the clinical nurse specialist. Now, what's going on there? Well, we can see from those first few lines that the normative way to do this might be to introduce yourself and then wait for someone else to introduce themselves in return. That's what happens in everyday conversations. And when it doesn't happen, as we saw in John's first slides, there's something kind of going on that's not normative. So what the clinical nurse specialist is doing is launching into a spiel. She's not doing an initial introduction as you would in everyday conversation. She's launching into a spiel about what's going to happen in the PIP assessment, who she is in terms of her institutional identity, not just her name. And so Jonathan is orienting to the first few lines, which is normative, to give your name after someone else has given her name, but that's not what happens here. So they're on different conversational tracks. Indeed, what then goes on to happen is she says, so your name's Joshua, and there's a big gap, and she pursues that with Joshua Fountain, is that correct? And he says, in overlap, and then Jonathan, sorry, I beg your pardon, Jonathan Fountain. So we can already see that when people talk at the same time, if this was produced, for example, as an interview account, those kind of overlaps might not be baked into the transcript. They might be put on different lines, but not shown that they're happening at the same time, or indeed they might not be transcribed in that way at all. So you would lose that detail. Now, what goes on to happen here is that Jonathan produces an account on his YouTube video, which is that he was very unhappy with how the personal independence payment started and indeed progressed. But without looking at the detail about when people are talking, you might miss some of those important details.
Okay, so I'm going to spend just a few minutes thinking about how to take this forward in terms of the analysis. Then you've got your recordings, you've been transcribing them, and you've been finding things of interest. At some point you want to identify, it's probably become clear by now that there are lots of potential areas that you could go into in looking at your transcripts. So it's important to have a focus. And you might have that focus from the original aim of the study, the thing that you're already interested in and the reason that you're trying to get those recordings. But there might also be a focus that comes up that you notice that's come up through the recordings and through the transcripts, which you hadn't previously anticipated. So some examples of different things that people have focused on might be sniffs in interaction. So just getting lots of examples of when people do that thing of saying something and then sniff or something else. Or, for example, switching pronouns for imagined constructed thought. So if you're describing somebody walking into a room and saying he walked into the room and he wasn't sure what was happening, and then you might switch to what you think might be going on inside his head. So he came into the room, he wondered what's happening and thinking, oh, am I doing this or am I doing that today? Or I'm not quite sure what's happening. And just that switch in pronoun might be something that you focus on. Other kind of broader focuses, those two are quite narrow, but other broader ones are things like how the questions get used. Questions are very common in institutional interactions and what kind of effects they have. And also how speakers go about achieving longer tasks, such as building up a relationship or establishing trust. How do you build rapport through maybe an hour-long visit? And as once you've identified the focus, then you'll be trying to make a collection of as many instances of those things, of that phenomena that you are finding in your recordings. So, for example, I worked on a study which looked at people phoning GP surgeries to make an appointment. And one of the things that we collected were examples of when receptionists kind of turned down a request for the appointment and what happened next, as a way of kind of understanding those calls. So once you've got your collection, then there are a number of tools, of analytic tools, that you might employ in your analysis. And I'm just going to go briefly through 4 of them here, which are probably 4 of the most common. So that's turn taking and transition relevant places where it may be relevant for the next speaker, for the other person to start talking. Adjacency pairs, next turn proof procedure, and preference organisation. I'll explain them as I go. So turn taking, it was established quite early on through that early work by Sachs that people take turns in conversations, but also that they follow established rules about whose turn it is to talk, when that turn is over and whose turn it is next. And as Joe has demonstrated, if people are talking at the same time, then they usually work very quickly to kind of resolve that so that they come back into these rules. So we saw the example before about the beginnings of telephone conversations of hello, hello. But you can also see something happening here in this next extract about kind of uncertainty about whether one speaker's turn is over and whose turn it is to speak next. So you see a practitioner here suggesting that we could, this is about in the context of parenting support, that we could do some parenting coaching over the phone if that would be easier. And at that point, the worker treats that turn as complete, but the parent doesn't take it up. And so by hearing that, the worker thinks, oh, maybe I've missed something, maybe there's something else that I haven't established, and goes on to say, if you wanted something like that. And the parent then is talking in overlap with yeah, and again, there's a bit of a gap there of a second where there's a bit of uncertainty about whose turn it is to talk next. And you can look at things like the gaps between turns or overlapping talk as a way to get into some of the dynamics in conversations about who's taking which turn. So the second kind of tool that we're going to look at briefly is around adjacency pairs, and that's based on the notion that talk is a form of action, and that it is structured and sequenced in pairs. So you get these pairs of talk which have particular kind of functions in them. And they're made up of a first pair part and a second pair part. So you'll get kind of adjacency pairs around greeting and a greeting, like hello, hello. Or you might get an invitation, which sets up a second pair part of either accepting the invitation or turning it down. And there are other examples, like if somebody offers to do something or makes an offer, whether that gets accepted, and also whether people are asking for things, so a request for action or for information. So you can see there that the person who is saying the first part of an adjacency pair has a certain amount of influence over the kinds of answers or kinds of responses that might be relevant or appropriate, and so has a greater level of control really about, or influence over, which direction the conversation is going. So there's an example here, just, I mean, the examples here suggest that what the second turn comes immediately after the first turn. That's not always the case. And here it is an example of the beginning of a call where a worker is introducing themselves and explaining it's Mel from the parenting service. Now, what you would expect there is that the second pair, second part of that pair would be a kind of a confirmation of understanding and giving their own name. But because I think what's happened here is that the parent is on a mobile phone with a really poor signal that they can't hear, and so the worker kind of has another go at their first part, and then again, and then there's the parent that has to move outside to get a better signal, and it's only after the fourth attempt at introducing herself that the parent then recognizes and communicates that in their tone of, oh, hello. So although adjacency pairs come in pairs, there can be lots of activity in between the first part and the second part. And when you're looking at things like how decisions get made, that can mean that you're analysing huge, well, kind of quite long stretches of transcript to try and identify where the second part comes. So the third tool that I'm going to introduce here is this notion of a next turn proof procedure. Conversation analysts quite like these kind of terms which can be quite technical but have quite specific kind of meanings to them. This is based on a commitment, because the principle of CA is that you're trying to find out what the speakers themselves have been orienting to in their interaction, and not imposing your own ideas about that. Then to get evidence of that, you're always looking to see what happened in the next turn afterwards for evidence of how speakers have analysed what's come immediately before them. So in this example, Anne says, why don't you come see me sometimes? This is in a conversation with her friend Barbara. Now, this could be read as a complaint or an invitation. Why don't you come see me sometimes? Or why don't you come see me sometimes? Barbara says, I would like to. And at that point, it's clear that Barbara has taken that as an invitation that she is willing to accept in principle. But Anne then goes on in the final turn, and she says, yes, but why don't you? So it's clear there that Barbara has treated that as an invitation, but Anne is intending it as a complaint, which she then pursues kind of beyond this. And so by looking at things turn by turn, you can build up an analysis of how the speakers themselves have been treating the interaction. And then finally, this is a very big topic in CA, it's around preference organisation, which is based on the notion that we shape our turns at talk for recipients. So the way that I will speak to Joe will be different from the way that I would speak to my children, for example. And that the specific point at which we make our turns, in which we say things, is based on what came before them. So it's dependent on its immediate context, but also it sets a new context for what comes afterwards. So heritage describes this as both context dependent and context renewing. And then when we take a turn, we also design our turn to either promote or undermine social solidarity. And that kind of ties in with this notion of social order. And one of the ways that it's argued that we do this is that if we're asked a yes or no question, that those questions are usually tilted in some way towards expecting a yes or no answer. So if I say, you'll probably want to come to my party on Friday, I would be anticipating that you'll say yes, and it'll be easy to give that response. So Pomerantz and Heritage say this as, if possible, if you're being asked one of these questions, that you would avoid or minimize explicitly stated disconfirmations in favor of confirmations in response to yes/no questions. here's a straightforward example for you after to illustrate this. So if I said, would you like to come to the movies on Friday? And the other person said yes, and they would just say, yeah, that sounds great. So the answer is almost immediate. It starts with a confirmation, so yeah, and a positive assessment, it sounds great. But if the other person didn't want to come to the movies, they might design their response in ways like this. So there might be a delay. There might be a pause of 0.8 seconds, for example. They might delay it by saying something like They might then preface their actual response by saying, I don't know for sure. I think I might have something else on that night. So kind of giving a reason as to why they wouldn't be available, and then a rejection of, can we make it another time? And there are lots of examples in this, particularly in institutional settings, where there are lots of questions about how people respond to those questions. So here's an example from Joe's data, which is based on Paul, who's a young man with a learning disability, and his 2 PAs, and Robert, and they're in the supermarket making choices about things that Paul wants to buy. So you'll see here that Paul points to a pack of 4 donuts, and he says, what about these? There's a delay of 0.7 seconds, and we've already seen that this length of delay is potentially meaningful, but potentially there's something up in the interaction. And Anne then says, rather than giving an assessment, she says they've only got 4 though. So there's something that she's problematizing about the donuts, rather than giving a kind of a straight confirmation of that. And then Rob says, well, almost that's a shame, I suppose, that there are only 4. And Anne goes on to explain, you only want 1. And as a result, Paul Paul ends up not buying the pack of 4 donuts. And when Paul makes a different choice, you can see that this runs off much more quickly. Paul points to the shelf and kind of interprets what he's doing through pointing, and says, you want a chocolate croissant? Paul says yes. Anne says okay, Rob says done, and Anne says that's a good idea. So that notion of the chocolate croissant as an appropriate choice, which is supported by Paul's personal assistants, is there evident in the interaction. And if they eat, whether intentionally or not, what we saw in the previous example was that when there was a potential problem with Paul's choice, that was evident in the interaction of the personal assistants, and that had consequences for whether that choice got followed through or not.
So I'm just going to give you some very brief examples from our own work about how this might be, how these things might be taken out into social care settings. So one example is from some previous research that I've done on how social care talk to people with dementia about their memories. It started from the point of view that we went into lots and lots of different care settings for people with dementia, like memory cafes, activity groups, day centres. And actually, we were just looking at something quite broad to start with, which was how people with, how social care staff support people with dementia in their everyday interactions. But it became very clear quite quickly that one of the big topics, one of the main things that people seem to do in those settings was ask people, was to get into conversations about, nostalgic memories. And we noticed, okay, there's this broad topic of memory talk, things like tell me about your wedding, or, holidays people went on, those kinds of things. But also the way that they were done had lots of different ways in terms of the implications that had for people. So we're being told that we have to wrap it up soon, so I'll be very quick and say that there were certain ways that people got into those conversations which actually could put people with dementia on the spot Whereas there were other ways, for example, staff used that were a bit more sensitive to the fact that people might not always remember their own memories. So the way some social care staff designed their talk was to downplay their own epistemic role or epistemic status, but also by giving prompts within a question. So doing things like, am I right in thinking that you got married in 10B? So am I right in thinking doesn't claim absolute right to know more about the person's memories than they do, but they embed the prompt within it. And that typically seemed to work as a better way to engage people in those kinds of conversations. I'm currently about to be, well, I just was very happy to hear that I'm recently funded by the SSCR to look at the role of companions in remote healthcare consultations for patients with learning disabilities. And I'm particularly interested in, for example, what difference in terms of interaction, having a mediated interaction over the phone or by a video link plays in how the companion, for example, a social care member of staff, navigates that interaction, what their responsibilities are in that interaction, and indeed when they should or shouldn't talk. And what by should or shouldn't, I mean when they treat themselves as having the right to talk or not. And we're currently also working on, John and I are working on a data set looking at evidence of reflective supervision and in social work supervisions. And I'm currently writing a paper, for example, on how decisions are made in child and family social work. And it's very difficult to actually say for sure when those decisions are made and how they're made, because as John said, the initial grain or kernel of the decision might come 15, 20 minutes before they finally get to a point where they decide if they are or are not going to make that decision. So that's just some brief examples of how you might take that out into the world. Oh, could I just,
sorry.
That's okay, click on that. If you, if indeed this is something that you're interested in, you want to ask yourself that question about how you might use conversational analysis in your own settings or in areas of your own interests. And I would say that in general, because so much of the work that we do is accomplished interactionally, conversational analysis is a method which is very adaptable and can be applied to almost any setting. And indeed, lots of the questions that we're interested in, for example, around policy is, policy doesn't exist as something out there, it's done in the to and fro of interaction. So I'm particularly interested in how policy gets enacted in practice by real people in real situations. If you're interested in learning more beyond this, this is a kind of whistle-stop tour of CA. There are lots of introductory courses, for example, at Loughborough, York and Oxford, which are a bit more in depth. I would like to direct you to the EMCA wiki. If you type in EMCA wiki on the internet.net, it's an amazing resource for anyone vaguely interested in conversational analysis. And there's lots of resources for further learning and conferences and events that you can attend.
So thank you. We did have a slide at the end for any questions. I've just seen all the messages in the chat. So apologies that there's a little time left, but Yvonne, is there something that we can help to do with in the remaining time?
Yes, I think so. There's a few people who've had to dash off, but there's certainly a lot of people really interested. So we've got about 3 minutes for questions. So they're quite complicated questions. So I wonder if there's a way that perhaps John and Jo could have a look at those and maybe post some answers in the chat. I don't know if that's possible, Angie, but I think there's a few kind of quicker ones. So I think there's one about how you interpret the pauses. How is that done? What is the kind of inference that's made there?
Well, one of the things that we try to do, that's a really great question, first of all. One of the things we try to do is look at how participants themselves interpret the pauses. So people might, for example, pause in the middle of their sentence. Well, how do we know it's a pause in the middle of their sentence? Because they might do things like, that mark that as explicitly their pause. So if I was to use continuing intonation in my sentence and say something like, so I was thinking about doing something else tomorrow, you know, the continuing intonation suggests that I'm going to continue talking. Also, people might do things like pause at grammatically or prosodically incomplete places, which also suggests that it's their pause. Whereas if someone else, for example, another participant treats that as them having finished, and they start to come in there, the next turn, which would be the next turn proof procedure, the speaker A rather than speaker B might say something like, well, I haven't finished yet. So we're always looking at how people treat those pauses and how they orient to them themselves, rather than the kind of slant that we might put on them.
Okay, so another, you know, there'll be no quick answers to any of this, I know, but question from Kate Gridley. She's saying, is there anything that we can learn from conversation analysis that could be applied to more traditional qualitative analysis, or is it an all or nothing thing?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it has been incorporated into some the analysis of interview data, for example. There was some work 20 or 30 years ago around kind of racism and how constructions of race and ethnicity came out in interview data. And I think increasingly some of the methods of transcribing have been used in qualitative interview studies as well, to give a bit more detail about what's happening in that interaction.
That's great. I'm really sorry we don't have much time. I've got like a minute left. But I feel like we maybe should have done a whole series on conversational. Should have just done the course.
What we can do, I've seen Angie's message as well, is if we stay on the call and do more responses in the chat. That would
be wonderful if you've got time. That'd be perfect. There's clearly lots of interest in this as well, and it's also an incredibly complicated area. So thank you both very much for a sort of whistle-stop starter. And I'm sure there'll maybe be a few people that might even send you some questions directly, if that's okay. Yeah, but thank you so much for giving us a bit of a taster in that.
Very welcome.
Thanks everyone for coming along. We will have plenty more webinars planned for next year. We haven't got them up on the website yet. There may be one on the 8th of December, but we're not entirely sure yet. But certainly next year there will be another fabulous full programme for everyone to sort of sign up and come along to. So thank you all very much for coming.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.